December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under a suffocating silence, the kind that comes only before a storm. Snow blanketed the Belgian hills in a deceptive calm, muting the roar of engines and the cries of men. Beneath that white stillness, the last great gamble of the Third Reich was underway. From the edge of the forest near Stavelot, Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wilke adjusted his binoculars, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Below him the valley burned. American trucks, hundreds of them, lay abandoned or wrecked along the road, a frozen artery of war clogged with metal and fire. The smell of diesel and cordite filled the air. "Mein Gott," one of his lieutenants whispered. "Look at all of it." Wilke didn't answer. He was calculating. Before him stood row upon row of giant cylindrical tanks, American fuel depots left behind in the chaos of the retreat. Gasoline aviation fuel diesel tens of thousands of gallons, enough to keep his entire Kampfgruppe moving for days, maybe even enough to push the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division deeper toward the Meuse. The Ardennes Offensive Unternehmenwacht am Rhein had begun just 2 days earlier. It was Hitler's last desperate counterstrike to split the Allied front and seize Antwerp, forcing a negotiated peace in the West. But fuel was the iron heart of that dream, and it was beating out. Every tank, every half-track, every truck depended on it. Now, by some cruel twist of fortune, the Americans had left their lifeblood behind. Wilke signaled his men forward. The first Tiger tank rolled down the slope, its treads crushing frozen mud and snow, the black cross gleaming faintly beneath frost. Around it, infantry fanned out, men of the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, weary, hollow-eyed, but burning with purpose. The fuel depot loomed ahead, massive drums stacked like monuments to excess. American engineers had built them in haste, steel giants feeding the endless convoys that kept Patton's and Hodge's armies alive. To the Germans, it was an unimaginable sight. A corporal tore open the seal of a drum and inhaled. "High octane," he murmured. "They use this for their thunderbolts." "Careful," Wilke barked. "We ration what we can move. No waste." They worked quickly, funneling precious gallons into captured jeeps and tankers. Every drop was worth a bullet, maybe a life. Overhead, grey clouds pressed low, muffling the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere to the north, Kampfgruppe Piper was advancing, or trying to. Piper, the young SS commander, had orders to strike through the American lines and capture the Meuse River crossings. His column, over 5,000 men and 600 vehicles, was moving fast but bleeding fuel. Every tank that ran dry became a coffin. Wilke's men filled their drums under the ghostly light of burning trucks. The snow turned black with soot. In the distance, an American jeep still smoked. Its driver slumped over the wheel, the body frozen in mid-turn. On his shoulder, a patch, 106th Infantry Division. Boys, most of them fresh from the States. "Sir," one of the men called out, "the road west is jammed with their convoys, miles of them." Wilke frowned. "Abandoned." "No, sir. Still moving." He raised his binoculars again. Through the falling snow, far beyond the depot, he saw them, a column stretching to the horizon. Dozens, then hundreds of trucks still rolling, headlights dimmed their engines, humming like an endless machine. Not fleeing, moving, supplying. The realization hit him harder than the cold ever could. These weren't the remnants of a broken army. This was the surface of an ocean, one that kept flowing, no matter how much you took from it. For every gallon he captured, the Americans were moving 1,000 more. A low rumble built behind him. Another Tiger appeared, its turret swiveling toward the road. "We can move again," the commander shouted. "We've got their fuel." Wilke nodded slowly. "Yea, but they have more." Night fell like a curtain. The depot glowed orange from scattered fires. Somewhere across the front, American artillery began probing the dark. their shells hissing through the snow. The men huddled in silence, watching the flames dance on the drums they hadn't yet touched. In his command truck, Wilke studied his map under a flickering lamp. Every kilometer forward meant another risk, another drop of fuel. The Americans could lose a depot, a convoy, a tank division, and barely feel it. Germany couldn't lose a truck without bleeding. He pressed his gloved fingers against the map, tracing the route to Stoumont, and then to Liège, their next objective. His pencil stopped halfway. The distance looked short, but the numbers whispered otherwise. Tomorrow, he muttered to himself, we push west. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of engines, not German, but American. A sound that would soon haunt every man in grey who believed victory was still possible. The night gave no rest. The air in the Ardennes was thick with exhaust and snow. In the pale dawn of December 18th, the column began to move again, steel beasts crawling westward through narrow Belgian roads that twisted like veins through the forest. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wilke rode in a half-track near the front, his breath visible in the frozen air inside the cramped cabin. Outside, soldiers clung to the sides of tanks wrapped in torn blankets, rifles slung low. The captured American jeeps led the way, painted hastily with black crosses. In their tanks and drums sloshed the spoils of the Stavelot depot, precious stolen fuel. The smell was everywhere, gasoline, oil smoke, and death. "Keep moving," Wilke ordered into his radio. "If we stop, we die here." Behind him, the tigers of Piper's Kampfgruppe followed like ghosts. The frozen roads slowed them to a crawl. Some tanks slipped into ditches, their treads spinning helplessly. Every kilometer consumed fuel that could not be replaced. The irony burned in Wilke's mind. They had captured more than they could carry, and still it was never enough. By midday, the 1st American Resistance appeared scattered groups of infantry from the 30th Division. They fired from hedgerows and stone barns, the cracks of their M1 Garands echoing across the valley. The Germans returned fire with MG-42 bursts that shredded branches and men alike. One of Wilke's platoon leaders reported over the radio, "They're stalling for time, Herr Oberstleutnant. Just delaying actions." "Of course they are," Wilke replied. "They know reinforcements are coming. They always come. That was the American secret, not courage alone, but abundance. Endless trucks, endless replacements. An army that could afford to lose a battle and still grow stronger." The column reached the outskirts of Stoumont by evening. The village was a cluster of stone houses and narrow lanes buried under snow. From its church tower, the German spotters saw distant movement columns of smoke to the west, the faint glimmer of convoys on the roads beyond. "Convoys again," one of the men said. "More of them." Wilke lowered his binoculars, his jaw tight. "They're refueling the front, even as we fight." He dismounted and walked through the snow toward a burning American truck, its side riddled with bullet holes. Inside, charred barrels leaked fuel that melted black trails through the white. He crouched beside one, pressing a hand to the metal. It was still warm. This was America's war. Not about courage or will, but supply. The Americans were not just soldiers, they were an industrial organism. For every Tiger, they had 10 Shermans. For every fallen pilot, 100 trained replacements. For every fuel depot captured, another stood behind it, unseen, untouched, inexhaustible. As the Germans prepared to occupy Stoumont, artillery began to fall. The first shell struck the edge of the forest, showering the road with splinters. Then came another and another, until the air shook with the roar of the US 30th Infantry Division's counter-battery fire. "Scatter," someone shouted. The road exploded in flame. Wilke dove into a ditch as fragments ripped through the snow. A tank ahead of him, an American Sherman they had commandeered hours earlier, was hit dead center, erupting in a tower of orange fire. The crew screamed briefly, then went silent. When the barrage ceased, the road was cratered, half the vehicles disabled. Fuel trucks burned like torches, the stolen gasoline, their lifeline, turned against them, devouring the convoy. Wilke rose, brushing soot from his coat. Around him, his men worked frantically to salvage what they could. Some siphoned fuel from wrecks, others dragged wounded soldiers away from the flames. Orders from Piper, a sergeant yelled, running through the smoke. "We press on! Stoumont must fall tonight." Wilke hesitated, and after Stoumont then to L'Église, the Meuse. The words sounded hollow even to the sergeant himself. Everyone knew the truth. The fuel they had wouldn't take them that far. The Americans had begun to regroup, and every hour brought more of them tanks, artillery, aircraft, once the weather cleared. As night fell, Stoumont became a furnace. The Germans fought from house to house, bayonet to bayonet, their advance lit by burning trucks and tracer fire. Civilians huddled in cellars as walls shook and glass shattered. At one point, Wilke ducked behind a stone wall as a P-47 Thunderbolt screamed overhead, strafing the road. The snow erupted in fountains where its machine guns struck. Even through the blizzard, American air power was clawing its way back. When dawn came again, Stoumont was in ruins. The Germans held the village barely, but their victory tasted like ash. The captured fuel was nearly gone, their losses severe, their radios full of static and desperate calls. In the cold morning light, Wilke stood at the edge of the road looking west. The horizon glowed with the distant fires of more battles and the endless hum of engines that never stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his aide quietly. The convoys, Wilke nodded. "Yes. The sound of an army that cannot be defeated by courage alone." The wind howled across the snow-dusted ruins of Stoumont. Smoke rose in black columns from burning tanks curling into the pale winter sky. The air was thick with the scent of fuel oil and death, a heavy perfume of defeat that no man could ignore. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wilke stood beside a crippled Panther tank, its engine still ticking faintly as it cooled. The crew lay nearby, covered with army blankets, stiffened by frost. Beyond them, what remained of his column stretched along the road, half the vehicles burned, the rest dry of fuel. The captured American gasoline had lasted barely a day. At first they tried to ration it. Each vehicle received only enough to reach L'Église, their next objective. But the terrain, the shell holes, the freezing cold, all conspired to drain their tanks faster than any plan could account for. Now the road was littered with hulks that had simply stopped moving. "Orders, sir," his driver asked quietly. Wilke stared west. Somewhere beyond those forests lay the Meuse River, and beyond it the dream of splitting the Allied front. But dreams could not run without fuel. "We hold," he said finally. "We hold until we're told otherwise." It was a lie, and both men knew it. That afternoon, an SS courier on a motorcycle arrived, his uniform covered in ice. He brought orders from Piper himself: conserve fuel, expect counterattacks. "Hold L'Église at all costs." Wilke read the message twice. The words "at all costs" had lost all meaning. "Does Piper still think we can reach the Meuse?" he asked. The courier hesitated. "He still hopes, sir." Wilke almost laughed. "Hope doesn't move tanks." By dusk, the Americans had closed in. The 119th Infantry and the 740th Tank Battalion surrounded the area from three sides, cutting off escape routes. The first shells fell just after sunset, ripping through the tree line. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. The Germans scrambled to return fire, but their ammunition was low, their engines useless. Wilke's men used captured American bazookas and machine guns scavenged from the dead. Every firefight burned through what little they had left, bullets, grenades, even morale. Inside a ruined farmhouse that now served as his command post, Wilke spread his maps on a table lit by a single lantern. The wind whistled through shattered windows. He marked the latest positions with a trembling pencil, blue arrows closing in from every direction. His adjutant, a young lieutenant named Fisher, leaned over the table. "Sir, if we can't refuel, we'll have to abandon the vehicles." Wilke looked up sharply. "And walk through snow with American armor on every road. It's that, or wait here to die," Fisher said softly. Wilke said nothing. The truth was too heavy to voice. He had fought since Poland, through France, through Russia. He had seen armies crumble and cities burn. But never had he felt this, the sense that he was staring at the physical weight of defeat, not in ideology, not in spirit, but in sheer mechanical reality. Across the room, one of his men was reading aloud from a captured American leaflet printed in German. It showed an Allied convoy, endless trucks rolling down a highway, under the headline, "Every minute another mile to victory." The men laughed bitterly. "They mock us, even in their propaganda," one said. But Wilke shook his head. "No, they're not mocking. They're telling the truth." At dawn, the Americans attacked again. Tanks approached from the south, their turrets cutting through the mist. Wilke's men fired Panzerfausts from windows and ditches, destroying 2 Shermans before the rest fell back behind smoke. The counterfire was relentless. Houses collapsed under direct hits, trees splintered. By noon, their last Tiger tanks sputtered and died. The driver climbed out weeping, clutching an empty jerry can. "She's dry," he said. Wilke watched the smoke drift from the wrecked machine, its turret frozen in place, like a dead animal staring blindly at the sky. When the shelling paused, he stepped outside. The world was grey and silent except for the distant rumble of American engines, constant, patient, unstoppable. He imagined those convoys again, miles long, stretching back to the coast, to the factories, to the shipyards, to an entire continent that never slept. That was when the realization truly settled in Germany, could win a battle, maybe even a week of victories. But it could not win against an enemy whose strength was measured not in courage or terrain, but in supply. War was no longer about men, it was about machines. And America had more of them than the world had ever seen. Wilke turned back toward his men, who now sat in small groups shivering beside fires made from broken furniture. Their uniforms were torn, their faces grey with exhaustion. He saw in them not fear, but emptiness, the quiet understanding that the road west had ended here. He lowered himself onto a wooden crate, took off his gloves, and held his hands to the fire. "Tell them to prepare to withdraw on foot," he said finally. "We can't hold La Glaise. Withdraw where Sir Fisher asked." Wilke looked into the flames, eyes distant, east. Always east. The wind outside carried the low hum of American engines, a sound as steady as time itself. The road to La Glaise was a graveyard of steel. Abandoned Panthers leaned in ditches, their turrets frozen, mid-turn, their crews long gone. The snow, blackened by soot, had begun to swallow the wrecks. It was December 22nd, 1944, 5 days after the fuel depot at Stavelot had fallen into German hands, and already it felt like a different war entirely. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wilke trudged through the snow beside what remained of his unit. The once proud column had dissolved into scattered platoons, men on foot, their boots leaking, their faces hollow. They carried what they could, rifles, a few jerry cans, and the weight of futility. From the ridgeline he could see the village of La Glaise below, or what was left of it. Smoke hung over it like a shroud. American artillery had reduced half the town to rubble. Somewhere among the ruins, Kampfgruppe Piper was still fighting, surrounded, cut off from supply and rescue. Wilke stopped and raised his binoculars. Through the swirling snow, he saw movement flashes of tracer fire, the silhouettes of tanks maneuvering among the wreckage. He could make out American markings on the turrets, Shermans advancing methodically, supported by infantry and aircraft circling overhead. One of his men caught up beside him, panting. "Sir, we've got nothing left to fight with. No fuel, no ammo. The men are freezing." Wilke lowered his binoculars. "Then we stop fighting," he said quietly, "and start surviving." He gave the order to break into small groups and head east toward the River. No one cheered, no one argued. They just nodded, men too tired to feel shame. As they descended the slope, they passed a wrecked American truck still bearing its white star. Its canvas cover had been torn open, revealing crates of canned food, blankets, and cigarettes. The Germans stopped and stared. Even now, amid total destruction, the Americans' abundance was surreal, trucks filled with supplies that never seemed to end. A private muttered, "They fight with everything we don't have." Wilke picked up a tin of coffee still sealed. "They fight with everything we can't make." He pocketed it not as a trophy but as a reminder, a relic of a truth no one in Berlin seemed willing to admit. By evening the sky turned blood red from distant fires. The snow reflected it, casting the forest in eerie orange light. Somewhere far behind them, a glaze burned. Piper's column, once the spearhead of the offensive, was being annihilated. Tanks out of fuel crews, abandoning their vehicles to fight on foot, surrounded on all sides. Wilke and his men crossed a frozen creek and made camp in the woods. They had no tents, no heat, and little food. The silence was immense, broken only by the occasional distant thud of artillery. As night deepened, Wilke sat apart from the others, staring into the darkness. He thought of the depot at Stavelot, the endless rows of drums, the rivers of fuel they had briefly controlled. For one day, it had seemed possible to turn the tide, to move again, to strike deep into Allied lines. But that illusion had evaporated faster than gasoline on a cold road. He realized then what he had refused to admit for years: Germany's defeat had not been written in one battle or another. It had been written the moment their enemies could replace, faster than they could destroy. America's factories, shipyards, and refineries were not just behind the front, they were the front. The Germans had mastered tactics, innovation, even courage. But none of it mattered against an enemy that could outproduce the world. He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph his wife and son taken before the war. He hadn't seen them in almost 3 years. Around him, his men slept, fitfully wrapped in whatever they could find. For the first time in his career, he felt something heavier than fear, insignificance. He whispered to himself, "The war is over. They just don't know it yet." The next morning, the rumble of engines came from the east, not German, but American, armored vehicles cresting the ridge, their white stars gleaming through the snowfall. The German soldiers rose from the snowbanks, weapons lowered, too exhausted to resist. A few shots rang out in panic, then silence. Wilke stepped forward, unarmed, his hands raised. The nearest American, a lieutenant with a cigarette dangling from his lip, approached cautiously. "You in charge here?" the American asked. Wilke nodded. "What's left of it?" The lieutenant looked him over, then gestured toward the burning valley behind them. "Hell of a mess you made." Wilke glanced back toward Leglay's smoke curling into the morning air. "Not enough," he said quietly. "Never enough." As he was led away, he passed the endless line of American supply trucks rumbling forward, fuel, food, ammunition, everything an army could need. They kept coming, stretching beyond sight. The sound was deafening, mechanical, eternal. Wilke turned his head one last time toward the west, where the horizon glowed faintly red, and murmured words only the wind could hear. This is how empires die, not with surrender, but with exhaustion. The convoy moved on, engines humming indifferent and unstoppable. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for weeks more, but for Wilke the outcome had already been decided on a frozen road outside Stavelot, the day he saw the infinite machinery of a world Germany could never match.